Welcome to the Inspiring Tech Leaders podcast with me, Dave Roberts. This week, my special guest is David Wilde. David is a fellow of the Institute of Directors with over 30 years in central and local government. As a CIO for a number of councils in central government, David has led many successful turnaround programs across IT and digital, as well as creating and establishing award-winning technology strategies. David is also a special advisor to the board at North and part of the GovX digital program. Welcome to the podcast, David. It's fantastic to have you here today.
Great and good to be speaking, Dave. Looking forward to it.
Great stuff. So what we always like to do is understand a little bit about the person's career journey that they've been through and how they landed up in the position where they are today. So perhaps if you can just talk to us a little bit about your career path and was it the one that you always wanted to follow?
In short, no.
It never is.
No, it never is. No, I wanted to be a cartographer and kind of do jungles and things like that. And then I discovered I'd have to spend an awful lot of time at university and beyond before I could even get a look in, let alone go abroad. So while I was kind of pondering my career at the age of 18, I was persuaded to go and join the civil service by some people in the job centre. I thought it looked quite nice. So I forewent my sort of degree journey and chose to join the civil service and found myself working in a benefit office at the age of 18 in the early 80s. So that was interesting. And from there, very fortunately, I had a very rapid rise through the civil service. And within 3 years, I wasn't just working in a benefit office, I was actually running one in Battersea. And from there, IT kind of surfaced about 5 years into my career when an opportunity to go and join the head office finance team and build something called a general ledger system. I had no clue what it was, came up. And there I was running a dole office at the time. So I went for the role, got it, turned up, moved to Sheffield, had a load of folders dumped on my desk and basically told, learn this system and can you build the user interface, please? And that was the beginning of my IT career. So I then went on to get involved in building finance systems for a number of years, which was great fun. And then took a kind of a shift left into policy work for a while in education. And in that education environment, I kind of built my policy knowledge and what have you in working in Whitehall, and I learned about how government worked. And from there, kind of drifted into turnarounds. My first experience turnaround, which was I developed a taste and a reputation for taking teams that weren't working properly and making them work a bit better. And this was this would have been in about the mid-90s. And what was happening, of course, in the IT world at that point, as we know, was IT was having a bit of a torrid time, pace of IT and stuff. And I increasingly seemed to be doing turnarounds on IT functions. And as I did more and more of that, I ended up growing my expertise and knowledge in technology as a kind of strategist and as a turnaround specialist in that area. And that's where my kind of career stuck in technology and grew at the strategic level and into the senior leadership level. And I ended up taking on my first CIO role in the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister in 2001 and kind of went on from there. So there you go. Interesting and circuitous route.
And then you took a turn into the councils, didn't you? So you worked for a number of different councils during the next sort of period of your career. What made you take that change from being in central government going back into the council area of working?
A really interesting one, because in central government you deal with huge budgets and significant national policy issues. So I was responsible for a lot of the funding for funding IT actually across the whole of local government in the UK. And so I had these great big budgets and I was allocating this money out. But you're a long way from where that money makes a difference. Yeah. So you're dealing with policy abstract, legislation, large scale funding, and all that kind of fun stuff, but you're not actually seeing how it's making a difference to real people on the ground. And I was approached to come and join a new leadership team in one of the London boroughs in Waltham Forest by some headhunters, and I looked and I just thought, actually, I would really like to see how this stuff works in a locality and how it actually makes an impact on residents. And so I moved into local government off the back of that and joined Waltham Forest, and I really got a taste for it. I mean, as I say, in central government, working on legislation and doing large-scale national stuff is interesting on one level, but actually doing some stuff around how technology is making a difference to deprived people in a challenged part of London, and you're down there and you're meeting them and you're seeing the impact it has on life chances and family and employment and what have you, it's really quite addictive and was really rewarding. So I stayed in it. And after 4 years in Waltham Forest, I was then asked to join Westminster, where I ended up with the mix of both worlds. Where Westminster as a global city is dealing with massive issues. So I was dealing with some very, very big stuff. Everything from, of course, we had the royal family on the pat, through to the similar issues I was dealing in Waltham Forest. So I got the best of both worlds there for a few years, and then latterly, Essex. Where I was then dealing with a much bigger geography and a more complex environment relative to London boroughs, but it's my home, and I was actually able to make a difference to where I live.
So actually, tell me a little bit more about that, because I know you led some work when you were at Essex Council to help move them from being a poor performer to being a national exemplifier in information sharing. What did that look like?
Yeah, well, what had happened was we'd been given a warning by the Information Commissioner's Office over what we were doing with information, and we had to do something about it. And so I took a look at what the issues were and looked at the time at FOI, Data Protection Act, all the usual kind of legislative stuff we all deal with. And funnily enough, very little of it was about technology. A lot of it was about workforce behaviour, culture, attitude and approach, and respect for the information that we looked after. The reality in local government is we are not owners. They call us data owners in under the ICO term, but we're actually custodians of most of the data we have, and it's on behalf of our residents and businesses. So what I did was I actually established a program of work that took that education through the organisation, coupled with some very hard and fast rules of do's and don'ts about what you do in line with legislation. And also we carried out a large scale sort of data cleansing. So the techie bit, if you like, was sorting out what data we had and made sure that we were in good shape. That program took the best part of 4 years. Massive undertaking, 11,000 staff to go through, and a very complex legacy that we worked through. But at the end of it, we had established, put in place, and truly changed the culture in depth. To this day, they are still a national leader in this field. And you've got to remember, I was doing this from 2011 to 15. So, 6 years later, still a national leader in this field. And the whole Essex information sharing framework and all of the ecosystem that we built around that has been copied by lots of public agencies across the UK. And long may it live.
That's fantastic. That's really great. So what was the motivation then for you to move away from those sort of permanent CIO roles that you were doing to create your own consultancy, which was probably about 3.5 years ago when you started that? What was the motivation for you to do that?
A couple of things. I mean, the first one, I was getting increasingly convinced that to make the kind of changes that we need to make in public sector, a lot of it needs to be driven from the outside in. Yeah, because when you're within the machine, it's actually harder to make some of those changes happen. And some of the knowledge and experience that we built up, I wanted to share more widely and wanted to move that out into a broader platform. I'd moved 3 times. There's only so many local authorities you can move to. And so I thought, right, actually, why don't I exit as an employee? I'm a very fortunate position that, I was able to do that. And my original plan was actually to go kind of part-time. And do a bit of consulting work and also build out some work in charity sector. So to do some work, sharing my knowledge, mainly in the education sector because my policy background. That was an epic fail because very quickly I ended up establishing the company. We now have a bunch of people that work for us and a whole bunch of associates. I am a long, long way from being semi-retired. Anytime soon.
All great plans, eh?
Yeah, exactly. And the funniest thing, Dave, was the initial thought I was going to take 3 months off. I ended up with 6 days.
I hope they were a good 6 days.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, before I was doing some quite intensive stuff for a big county council at Worcestershire over in the West Country. So I kind of that. But the one thing I have held on to when I made those decisions was that commitment to doing not-for-profit work, because that's something education is something I've always been passionate about. And yeah, we get education right in the holistic sense, life chances for children through adulthood, and productivity for the nation, all that kind of stuff, all flow from doing that right. And, in the education world, paying for CIOs is not something that multi-academy trusts that run schools can afford. So my knowledge and expertise being given to a couple of multi-academy trusts. I'm a director on Eastern Multi-Academy Trust in Norfolk and the Vine Multi-Academy Trust in Essex, two quite different entities. But I get a huge amount of reward and satisfaction about sharing my knowledge for nothing into those organizations to help them embrace technology and use it in how we can educate people better going forward. And it's something that I absolutely, I'm very, very pleased about the fact that I've stuck to that, even though work got really busy.
And you've also been helping with some of the NHS hospital trusts as well as a non-exec director.
Yes, I did 3 years as a non-exec at what was Mid-Essex NHS Trust. That was an education and a half. It makes you appreciate just how complex a machine the NHS is and how complex a machine a hospital is. And people think that NHS trusts are just one hospital. They're not. We actually had three. And it was a real eye opener to the challenges that they have, but also in some of the, quite frankly, some of the dysfunction that still exists in the sheer scale and complexity of what the NHS is. But one thing that really stuck with me throughout that was the absolute commitment of staff, and we've seen it through COVID, in spades in the last year. Their absolute commitment to do the right thing for people is absolutely to be celebrated. My frustration on many of my meetings when I was in Med was actually getting the NHS to understand how technology can help with productivity. A lot of the IT in the NHS is still quite old, and a lot of the infrastructure is still quite old. So you get these weird kind of extremes where you'll have an operating theatre with state-of-the-art robotics, next to a scanning room that's using Windows 98. That kind of mixed economy of technology is one of the big challenges. And NHS has been trying to resolve this, obviously, through mega programs like National Programme for IT in the Nordics and all this stuff, and has still, I think, a long way from being able to crack it. The big challenge I find with it is there is a misnomer that the NHS is a single entity. It absolutely isn't. It is 3,000 or 4,000 companies. It is a huge ecosystem that employs millions. And the governance around these things. So there I was, a non-exec director on an NHS trust, one of a few hundred, all with their own boards, all making their own decisions, all within the NHS family.
That must be difficult to get alignment then.
It is. I mean, part of what we were doing when I was on that trust, we were navigating through the merger of three trusts. So we took Mid-Essex, Basildon and Southend trusts. And they've now been merged into one, which is the Mid and South NHS Trust. And that in itself was a hugely complex model. And even within those three trusts, we actually had different patient management systems. We had different IT solutions. So that gives, that was just for those three. What we did manage to do was establish an IT strategy and a 4-year investment program to get alignment across those three. So I kind of look at it and I go, that's 3 down, a couple of hundred to go.
That's absolutely huge. So how are you helping those types of organizations with their commercial thinking when it comes to technology?
I think there's a few things going on. I mean, my experience in government, both central and local government, I was very fortunate that as I reached kind of board level director stuff, I wasn't just doing technology. I was also responsible for delivery of services. So in Essex, I was also responsible for delivering place services, and in Waltham Forest, I had customer services. In Westminster, I worked across both of those as well. And that gave me a grounding that was broader than tech. So what I've been very fortunate in being able to do is be able to articulate to the board and to politicians what tech can do and how to do it. Yeah. And I've also been very clear that you need to use the market and shape the market to deliver the best you can deliver. So what I'm not into is getting into the relative merits of bits of tech. That's not what it's about. It's actually about, right, what's out there in terms of what can I do to improve how I manage environmental health, or what I need to do around schools, all that kind of stuff, and then using the market to get the best commercial deals to deliver. Now, the most recent developments in the tech world around cloud, around consumerization of IT and commoditization of applications means that we can be a lot quicker about adopting this stuff in the government environment. A lot of the consulting work I do at the moment with local authorities is about demystifying public sector procurement. Again, there's another misnomer out there that people believe that it's really complicated to buy anything in the public sector, and the supply side think it's really difficult to sell into the public sector. Neither are true. What is true is if a public sector organisation isn't quite clear about what they want, they shouldn't go using the market to work it out. They need to take a step back and be clearer about their position. And equally, on the supply side, don't go around thinking your product's the only one and nothing else should be bought, because people aren't that stupid. People will actually look and will look at what else is out there. So I think bringing those two things together means that you get a much sensible, set of buying decisions, commercial practices, and you get value. The other related thing about it, which I get a lot of people saying, which they welcome, I think quite differently about what the investment and return on investment is on these things. So good example of what goes on at the moment. A lot of talk about IoT. Now, IoT, great, wonderful stuff. My first question with anybody that we're dealing with IoT is, what do you want to do with it? I know what it is. I know how fantastic it is, and it's great, and I've got a ton of it in my house. But what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with IoT to improve the life chances of a teenager from a deprived area? What are you going to do with IoT to actually manage congestion? What are you going to do with IoT to deal with poor quality housing? What are you going to do with it to help older people who are feeling a little bit more vulnerable live independent lives for a bit longer? So the driver I constantly bring in on this kind of stuff is, I want to know what this will do, because it's not difficult to know what it is. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think the interesting thing with IoT is also the security around it as well, because you touched on the democratization of technology before. And IoT is a very, very good example of that. And it's easy enough to spin compute up in the cloud. And it's easy enough to gather data from IoT devices. But as you're saying, what do you do with them? But also, how do you secure them? And that's something which I think technology teams and IT teams are grappling with more and more these days, because of that democratization piece that we talked about, is that many more people have access to the technology to be able to gather this types of data. But we've also got to look about how we control that. So is that something that you've also seen?
Oh, big time. And we all know there's one of the great stories out there, isn't there, about hacks, which was the Target hack from a few years ago. And what was it that people used to get into the Target, where they managed to steal millions of customer details? It was a building management system they went through.
It's the things that people don't think about or don't necessarily always associate security vulnerabilities with.
Exactly. But what it does play out for me on that, Dave, is a really important point for organizations on enterprise IT. I've long been a big fan of enterprise IT and its understanding what enterprise IT really means, enterprise architecture really means. And it's something that we're in danger of losing if we're not careful in the profession. So the IT world, as you quite rightly said, IoT is reaching into the very fabric of organizations and very fabric of our physical environment. That's what IoT does. So if your technology functions and your responsibilities, whatever they may be, a local authority or a business or whatever, are going to maintain their integrity, the technology is going to have to reach out. And enterprise architecture is going to have to embrace all of that other active stuff that's coming on board, largely driven by IoT. So that it's no longer just about the servers, it's no longer just about necessarily the cloud applications, and it's not just about the end user devices. End user devices now aren't just the laptops, they are the sensors, they are the door entry systems, they are the environmental control systems. Now, what's positive, I guess, around that is what we're seeing in terms of the likes of SD-WAN and some of the other technologies that we're seeing coming through, is that the technology capability for enterprise architecture to get a grip on that stuff, actively monitor it, and to lock down and secure those things is there. But what we need to do as organizations, and what IT needs to do as a profession, is get the message across to the wider organization that it isn't just as simple as the thing on your desk that you log into.
If you look at the the extent of IoT and there's lots of positive impacts it can provide. If you look at smart cities and you look at autonomous vehicles, and there's lots of positive technology changes occurring, but I think the impact is also becoming far greater all the time.
There's a couple of really good examples of a couple of things I've been working or am working with a couple of colleagues on. As you said, you mentioned, I'm doing a lot of strategic advice to the board of North, which is a telecoms company with a very heavy IoT link. And again, it's out there in the public. They are working with Sunderland City and Nissan on mass scale autonomous vehicles. IoT is absolutely front and center on that. Without it, autonomous vehicles won't happen, because until we can manage the fixed assets, the roads and the environments that these vehicles are operating on using IoT, we're going to, it's a non-starter. Not least because of the safety elements. So that's already in play. One of the biggest opportunities here today, and is being embraced, is the potential or what IoT will do to support people living their lives, independent lives, longer. I'm very, very passionate about the idea that people don't really want to go into residential homes until they have to. Pretty straightforward. And they'd rather stay where they grew up or where they live or where they bought their house. And IoT can provide so much more in the way of security and safety for people who are perhaps at the early stages of dementia or a little bit unsteady or a little bit less confident in their everyday lives. IoT can provide a lot of the comfort and support to allow those people to stay at home longer and live fulfilling lives for longer, independently and on their terms. And that kind of stuff, that for me just makes IoT very meaningful to the population.
No, it's certainly, it has the ability to really enhance the communities that we live in, and that's that is positive for all. I think definitely underlined by the need for good enterprise architecture and evolving enterprise architecture that supports the changing technology landscape around it.
And the security layer that sits over that as part of that architecture is absolutely critical.
So another thing you mentioned earlier, you talked about COVID. What do you think has been the impact of COVID on the technology agenda? Do you think it's supported it, hindered it around innovation? What have you seen?
I think it's absolutely dispelled the myth about home working being difficult.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Let's move on now. Yeah, exactly. So that at the simplest level, that's been fantastic. I think the other thing it's dispelled is the myth that education must be delivered in big buildings with 30 kids in a room. Because what's happened around flexible learning, this is me with my kind of, multi-academy trust hat on, I have been massively impressed by the way that primary and secondary education has adapted and made use of this and helped children sustain education at time of crisis. And I would love to see a lot of what we've learned around flexible learning, and self-directed learning and home-based learning continuing, because I think where people are still saying that there's been lost learning, and there probably has been, and it has actually flushed out some challenges around deprivation and people having access to IT, which I think we should address and we should continue to address. It's exposed that as a weakness in our society that we should deal with. What it does do, I think, is you can almost flip it. One of the issues we had pre-COVID in the UK was the difficulty around increasing people's learning and increasing productivity. So one of the things the UK has constantly been criticised about is that we've kind of lagged in the tables of productivity around economic development, and a lot of people have pointed to education as being one of the challenges in that area. Now, what if we take what we've learned from COVID around technology-enabled flexible learning and all that kind of stuff and put that on top of the core learning that we have? The potential for pupils, for children to be the best they can be becomes even greater. And the potential on productivity in both education and in work, does this mean that we can break the cycle as a country that we've been in around the kind of productivity doldrums?
And I think it's also the extent, how far-reaching that can be as well across communities globally. So it's enabling more of those developing countries to have access to the right levels of education going forward.
And the other one we shouldn't lose sight of as well is environmental impact. I mean, we've all seen forgotten. Remember in the first 3 months, last year, the first couple of months of lockdown, and people were measuring, right, okay, environmental quality in London has improved 20%. We shouldn't lose sight of those simple things, by having less travel the way we used to, and less movement of things in the way we used to, can have a significant environmental benefit. So doesn't mean we'll end up staying that way. Of course we won't. But I think there are lessons to learn in there that we can apply. I, for one, am not missing the fact that I used to have to spend 3-4 hours getting from A to B at the beginning of a week for a client at the other end of the country, when I've been able to do all the work I would have done remotely. When I choose to travel, it's because it's needed rather than it's habit. And I think that's a key element of what we should bring out of COVID.
Well, I look at my own commute, and I've managed to save around 10 hours a week just in commute time, which is you're able to put that to far better use now, but also supporting our company's net zero carbon reduction pledge that we've made. These are all those factors that contribute towards helping that. But if you think if we'd been in a similar situation, perhaps only 5 or 10 years ago, the impact it would have had, to the world, it was happened back then to now, with the technology that we've got available, I think has helped to support and keep businesses running and education and society in general.
There is another good positive conversation. I mean, COVID's been dreadful in many respects. There's nothing you can't avoid. It's been an awful death toll and all of that kind of stuff. But I look at it and I go, what are the big things that are positive about this? I think there was some. It's made us, humanity, without being too big a speak, but it's made us look in the mirror on a bunch of things and actually take some different choices, which I think is good, and hopefully they'll stay. And I think what it's also done is it's brought to the surface some things that were happening that we're now having to deal with. So retail, what's happening in the retail world? We knew it was drifting. The old retail world was drifting into obsolescence. Somebody just put their foot on the accelerator and hit the wall. Yeah, basically in the retail world. And what that as a consequence has done, and this is me with my kind of local government hat on, is it's made the public sector turn around and realise they can't just faff around with town centres. They're going to have to get off the fence and start doing something proactive. Otherwise, these are large pieces of real estate in our country that are going to go to rack and ruin. And so what it's driven, it's beginning to drive now, I'm now seeing this beginning to happen, is organisations are coming out of crisis and emergency management, and they're looking around and they're going, all right, we've got to deal with this. So how are we going to deal with regenerating a town centre? How are we going to deal with the fact that, retail as an online offer is here to stay, but what's going to replace it? That kind of stuff has really come to the fore, and I think that's great. I mean, the one telling one for me was the can't remember the name of the outfit. The outfit that bought the name of most of the Arcadia names and just said, "I only want the names. I don't want any of the shops." End of. Yeah, that kind of summed up the retail world, didn't it?
Ever changing, I think, as well. It's definitely evolving. So, what do you think are those main challenges that are facing technology leaders today?
I think the first thing we've actually touched on one and spoken at length, I think, which is the enterprise architecture becoming much more comprehensive than it has been, and absolutely embracing that IoT piece. That's a here and now.
Yeah.
I think the second big one around technology leaders is doing more of the kind of thing I described, which is let's stop describing what it is and start describing more about what it does and the impact it has. That for me is the key of being in C-suite and not.
And how are you communicating those factors, though, to the C-suite? How do you get that value of technology across the board?
Yeah, and quite simply, you've got to understand what the organisation, what you're doing, who you work with, what it is that's driving them and what matters to them. And you need to translate what the stuff is you've got here that will contribute to that. Because if you can't do that, it ain't going to happen.
I always think it's about talking in outcomes, be that either community or business outcomes rather than the underlying technology. The technology is how you get there. It's the outcome, it's the result that really matters, that you're going to drive that technology.
Another big challenge, I think, in the technology world is skills. I think we've got, I'm finding, I don't know if you find this, there are certain skill sets that we're in danger of neglecting. Enterprise architecture is one. I think they are becoming a rarer race. and we need more of them because it's becoming a more complex landscape. So I'm seeing that as a danger area. I think the other area around skills is around how do I put this? I think it's around unlocking latent capability in workforce. So what we have a lot of people that are a lot more digitally savvy than we give them credit for. We all do our online banking, online shopping, all that kind of stuff. But too often I see organizations that recruit people to take them in and they dumb down their ability to do IT because they want the corporate IT to conform to standards. Do you know what I mean? So I think one of our issues, technology challenges, is we need to accept that these people are competent, capable adults and actually have a bit of digital savvy about them and enable them to make the best of what that is. Now, the consequence of that is we need to be a little bit less rigid about what we want people to do with the technology we put in places and put in businesses. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I think for many years we've spoken about the IT skills shortage, and I don't think that's particularly changed a huge amount. I think there's just certain areas that have become a lot more difficult to find the right talents for. You've mentioned some of them already. I think from my perspective, I think the one that we need the most when you're thinking about developing products and services is probably around DevSecOps, because you've got getting talented security people is difficult anyway, but then having someone who can actually program and develop, but also have the ability to have security oversight and have security by design, that is a really important skill set to have. But there's not a huge amount of those types of people in the market at the moment. So for me, I'd probably put DevSecOps at the top of my list of really would like to have more of them.
That's a really good call, actually. And I think what's interesting, isn't it, how quickly commercial drivers push these things through. So, data scientists are the rock stars at the moment in terms of salary and remuneration and all that kind of stuff. And security isn't. Now, which one of those, if they get it wrong, is going to break your business?
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that is certainly happening now. The boards are becoming much more conscious of the security posture of their organizations than ever before. It really is a board level agenda item that's you see it a lot more in the last few years. Definitely, I'd say over the last 5 years, it's massively changed in that space.
And I think it's also, we maybe haven't given enough credit for COVID, actually, and the lockdown actually bringing that more into the light again. Because, again, it's one of the common themes I'm finding about the COVID thing is it's brought things out from the shadows and into the light and people having to face up to them. Because, of course, one of the things we did see with lockdown and everybody moving to mobile flexible working was a massive increase on cybercrime activity. Huge increase, and we had nation state security organisations telling us that the number of attempted hacks in the UK has gone up 500-fold, etc., etc. So I think part of what has happened through the last 12 months, I think, is that has become more visible and people talk about it more. And the rider to that, I think, for the challenge with the security community is then we need to use that to persuade organisations to invest more and do more. I mean, with my little company, I've spent the time and effort and input to make absolutely sure that we're cyber essential. We're certified. It's a pain, but actually you can't not in this day and age.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we are starting to run out of time, and there's one key question I still want to ask you, which was, what has been that best bit of advice that you received during your career ascent, and what advice would you give to others now?
I'll go back to my, and it's not an IT one, it's my policy days. I was very fortunate to work for a policy guy in the Department for Education, old school civil servant, straight out of Yes Minister, and he taught me how to write proper briefs, how to write a proper submission to ministers. And he taught me that, quite simply, you should always have 3 options. Whenever you're putting proposals, and I still use this to boards, to politicians, to everybody else, there should always be 3 choices. There's always do nothing, because it's always a choice. There's always the preferred choice, but there is always the brave choice. Or if you're worried that they'll choose the brave choice, make damn sure it's a courageous choice. because the people need to understand the consequences of what they decide to do, and you need to be able to encompass that in a document that's never more than 4 pages long.
That's very good advice. Get to the point about what you're trying to achieve, I think.
Absolutely. Oh, and he was a stickler for grammar.
Good. Well, thank you so much. I feel like we could have a much longer conversation, but we'll have to end it there. So thank you very much for taking the time out today, David. I really appreciate the insight and experience that you've shared with the audience today.
Yeah, no problem at all. Great pleasure, David. Thanks.
In next week's podcast, I'll be talking with Graham Hackland, who is the Chief Information Officer for Williams Formula One Racing. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and stay tuned for more inspiring tech leaders.